mute it. So good. Okay. Done. Okay. Okay. So we will start today. Last week, we left off on Acts 24. And Felix, who was the governor of this province, he lived in Caesarea. Paul had been brought to Caesarea, and they did a...
Mary, can I interrupt you for 1 second? I'm so sorry to do this to you. They can barely hear you guys. The sound's really low.
Okay, let's see. Is this...
That's much better.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So they were in Caesarea, and Felix was with his wife Drusilla, and Drusilla was a Jew, and we're going to talk a little bit more about her family line. She was the daughter of King Herrett, Agrippa the First, and we'll show the rest of it. Anyhow, they were in Caesarea. They did a trial, not really a trial, an investigation, and Felix did not know what to do with Paul, so he just left him as a prisoner, but he had a pretty good way of, a pretty good life there for 2 years. And the last line that we read was in Acts 24, and it says, after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So do you want to start off with, do you want to share the map and talk about the Herodian Dynasty?
Yeah, before we share the map, I just want to talk for a minute, because this is something that may help with a lot of the stories you read in the New Testament. I found that a lot of people are confused about this, so it's worth talking about. We all know Herod. We hear about Herod when Jesus is born, and then we hear again about Herod when Jesus is crucified. And what doesn't always come through is that these are not the same person. Herod is the name, it's kind of the last name. It's the name of a dynasty. But if you'll indulge me, I want to go back and tell you a little bit about, people wonder why the Herods are kind of as mean as they are. And it's important. It's really important to our understanding. So a few hundred years before this, Alexander the Great, if you remember, we studied that back in Daniel, but he and his armies have taken over this part of the world. They control what we know as Israel, as well as everything else in that area. But Alexander dies young, and his generals take over. They sort of split up his empire. And down in this area, sometimes they tolerate the Jews, they let them have their own religion, but then different people will take over, and some are very, very hostile to the Jews. And we reach a point where they're not only hostile, the guy who's in charge is sacrificing or making them sacrifice pigs in the temple, which, with their prohibition against unclean animals, and then a pagan sacrifice in the temple. So there's this country priest who's in and sees this, and he kills, he strikes down the person who's in the temple doing this pagan sacrifice. And he flees town, and he's yelling as he goes, anyone who would be free, follow me. So what happens is his sons, but then other people began to come out in the countryside, and they start a guerrilla war. They ride down, they kill a whole bunch of these Greeks, and then they disappear back into the hills. After a while, they're so effective, and they're known as Maccabees, but these Maccabees are so effective that they essentially liberate Israel, and they actually retake Jerusalem. And so far, yeah, it's a big story, but after they get control, they start telling themselves, we're so good at this, we're so successful, we need to go out and start conquering other people, other nations. And they do. They start riding in and taking over. But what they do is they force people to convert to Judaism at sword point. You either convert or die. Now, the guy, one of these Maccabees, appoints himself high priest, which he never should have done. And then they start riding in and forcibly converting other nations to Judaism.
And this is before Jesus'
This is
time.
250 years before. And they force convert. Well, one of the groups that they convert, there's a place down south of Israel called Edom. Those are, you hear them referred to as Edomites, but they also get called Idumeans. And the Idumeans were descendants of Esau. If you remember Jacob and Esau, Jacob steals the birthright of Esau, that whole story that we get. Well, the descendants of Esau are Idumeans, and they get forced to convert to Judaism. They are not Jews, but they get forced to convert. And they really are not happy about it. As you can imagine, if your people were forced to convert to some other religion or die, they bear a little bit of a grudge. Now the part that ties it together, Herod, all of his descendants, Herod the Great and his descendants, are Idumeans. So if you ever heard that, Herod was a Jew, and you've wondered why was he so hostile to other Jews, it's because he isn't really. He's really an Idumean, and all of his people were forced to convert to Judaism. And so we see this animosity carried down. And when Herod gets put in charge by the Romans, he's got a chance for a little bit of revenge. And the Jews, Israel, winds up paying a price for this thing they did all those years earlier by forcing people to convert. And so what you see, not only is Herod hostile, but his descendants. And so we get Herod the Great, we get Herod Antipas, we get Herod Philip, we get Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II, all of these, and it's confusing when you read and it says Herod did this or Herod did that. They're not the same people. It's descendants of this original Herod the Great, but they all sort of carry, so nominally they're Jews, and then they're also hostile because they didn't want to be Jews. And it's confusing, but if you keep that in mind, I think it'll kind of help some of this other stuff that happens through all the New Testament make better sense.
Can you share the screen? I want to show you that one, yeah. Okay. There we go. You guys can see it. Can you give me a thumbs up, Luis, if you can see it? Okay, cool. So this is, and we'll send this out so you can look at it later. So this is the dynasty of Herod the Great. So Herod the Great is the one who tried to kill baby Jesus way back then. And where are we today? The people that we're talking about today that are important is, first of all, Drusilla, number 13. Drusilla was Felix's wife. Felix, remember, he just left after being governor of the area for a number of years, but he was Herod Agrippa the First's daughter, and Drusilla was Herod Agrippa the Second's sister. So you're going to see him come up here in a minute, Herod Agrippa the Second, and you're also going to read about Bernice today. Bernice is another one of the siblings. So Herod Agrippa the First had 4 siblings, and today we're going to hear about a number of them. And Bernice was another one. And when we read this, you think Bernice and Herod Agrippa II are husband and wife, they're brother and sister, but they were also had an incestuous relationship.
We'll send this out, and I may do an extra segment to try and explain it. We aren't going to do it here, but there are a couple of things real quick. Hopefully you can notice. The Herod Antipas, the green one down there,
Number 6.
He takes his brother's wife, and he doesn't care that she's married. He takes her as his wife. And way down here in the bottom right, John the Baptist condemns what he's done, and he winds up getting beheaded for it. John the Baptist is beheaded by one of the Herods. And if you will send you this chart, but as you look at it, you begin to see that this Herod dynasty figures large in the entire New Testament. In all this history of Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, the Herod dynasty keeps coming up large. And what we're going to see, last thing about this for today, the guy who winds up being king at this time is called Herod Agrippa II. And he's the last of the Herods to rule. So at the same time that all of this, they have a place in this history. And then right now, as John goes off to be killed, that's going to be the end of them. So it's like they were meant.
Paul, you mean?
I mean, Paul, as Paul goes off to be killed, it's like the Herods were there to make a lot of these other things come to pass. It's really an amazing relationship. So we'll send that out. That's, I think, all we can do with that.
Okay. We're on Acts 25. 3 days after his arrival, and this is the arrival of Festus in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders presented their case against Paul. They urged Festus to grant them a concession against Paul by summoning him to Jerusalem, because they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. But Festus replied, Paul is being held in Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. So if this man has done anything wrong, let some of your leaders come down with me and accuse him there. After spending no more than 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day, he set up on the judgment seat and ordered that Paul be brought in. When Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges that they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have committed no offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to stand trial before me on these charges? Paul replied, I am standing before the judgment seat of Caesar, where I ought to be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if there is no truth to their accusations against me, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus conferred with the council and replied, you have appealed to Caesar you will go.
So you remember that all that time ago, Paul in Jerusalem, and they want to kill him. And they find out he's a Roman citizen, and they hustle him off to Caesarea, to Caesarea. And the charges there are no charges worthy of death. And so the governor Felix is in a bind, because if he lets this guy go, the Jews are going to kill him. They already wanted to kill him while he's in Roman custody. And yet he can't do anything. He can't execute him because he's a Roman citizen. So he just leaves him there to roam the city. And it's 2 years. Paul is there for 2 years with no charges, no place to go. And eventually that guy, Felix, gets relieved of his command. And the new guy comes in, and he finds out he's got this ghost roaming around the city, this guy who's no charges against him, but he can't be let go. And he goes up to Jerusalem, and the Jewish leaders, here's what I want you to understand. It's been 2 years that Paul has been hidden away in Caesarea, and they still bear such a grudge that what they do is they ask, well, why don't you bring him up here to Jerusalem and let us have a trial? And they already plotted that on the way they were going to kill him. So they've harbored this murderous rage for 2 years. They haven't seen him in 2 years, and they're still so angry that they're going to ambush him and kill him. And Festus is nobody's fool. He says, I'll tell you what, I'm about to head back to Caesarea. Why don't you guys come down where I am and we'll have our trial there? Paul defends it. In fact, there's no charges that stick. They don't bring witnesses. Paul really doesn't have anything to defend because they have no witnesses. But Festus senses, again, he's in a bind because he can't do anything with this guy. And so he asked Paul, well, how about if we go back up to Jerusalem and you have a real trial, because then it'll all be over with. And Paul says, yeah, no, I haven't done anything. He says, you're Caesar's judge. I'm already standing before Caesar's judgment seat. You're not going to get off that easy. They're not the judge for Caesar, you are. And if you're not going to do it, I appeal to Caesar. And Festus at least sees a way he can get Paul out of his hair. And he says, well, great, yeah, I'll be glad to send you to Caesar. It's an arrangement for someone who is politically astute. This is a smart thing to do. Yeah, I'll just send you off to Caesar. The problem is, and we're going to see it in this next chapter, what does he tell Caesar? I've got a guy here who hasn't done anything wrong. There are no legitimate charges against him, but I'm sending him to you. If you're a politician, that's probably not wise either. So
verse 13. So after several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice came down to Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Now, remember from seeing on that chart, King Agrippa and Bernice, I at first thought they were husband and wife. They're brothers and sisters acting like husband and wife. Bernice had been married, had been widowed twice and married a third time. And she was like 22 years old. And she decides now to be with her brother, King Agrippa. So King Agrippa and Bernice come down to Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were staying several days, Festus laid out Paul's case before the king. There's a certain man whom Felix left in prison. While I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews presented their case and requested a judgment against him. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand a man over before he has an opportunity to face his accusers and defend himself against their charges. So when they came here with me, I did not delay. The next day, I sat on the judgment seat and ordered that the man be brought in. But when his accusers rose to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. They only had some contentions with him regarding their own religion and a certain Jesus who had died, but whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Since I was at a loss as to how to investigate these matters, I asked if he was willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges. But when Paul appealed to be held over the decision of the emperor, I ordered that he be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Tomorrow you will hear him, Festus declared.
Okay, I know some of it may be a little confusing, but it's worth understanding. Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, he's one of the Herods, and the Romans have named him as a king. He is a guy who gets to pick the high priest. He has the authority to decide who gets to be high priest. He is, as I explained, he's nominally a Jew. Herod Agrippa, this king, does something that not all the Herods have done. He observes all of the feast days, all of the Sabbaths, and so he actually behaves like he's a real, a practicing Jew. And so the Jews more or less accept him. Nobody's ever universally liked, but they accept him, they tolerate him. And he comes to Caesarea, and this new ruler Festus says, hey, you're a Jew. I got a guy here who's been in custody for over 2 years. The last guy sort of left him to me. I inherited him. And he says, you might know what to do with him. The people, the priest and the lawyers came from Jerusalem, and they didn't bring any charges that made any sense. This is, it was supposed to be a Roman problem, But once they start bringing charges, this is really a religious problem. And I don't know what to do about that. I'm about to send him off to Caesar, and I don't have anything to charge him with. So why don't you come hear him? Or actually, Agrippa says, I want to hear this. But Festus lays this out, and he's hoping that maybe Agrippa will have some Jewish knowledge that'll help him figure out what to do with this guy. And Agrippa comes in, as Mary said, it seems like it is him and his wife. It is him and his sister, and it is everything it sounds like. And you see that in that he's not really behaving like a Jewish leader. That's not tolerated. But he says, yeah, this is entertaining. Never forget, there's no TV, there's no internet, there's no newspaper or magazine. So anything to sort of break up the boredom, especially by these rulers that don't have to work all the time, they're up for anything that sort of, like I said, breaks up the boredom. And so they go sit down to this should be fun. Let's hear what this guy has to say.
Verse 23, the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the auditorium, along with the commanders and the leading men of the city. And Festus ordered that Paul be brought in. Then Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him, both here and in Jerusalem, crying out that he ought not to live any longer. But I found he has done nothing worthy of death. And since he has now appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. I have nothing definite to write to our sovereign one about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after this inquiry, I may have something to write. For it seems unreasonable to me to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him.
Hopefully, he thinks Agrippa will hear this, because it's been the entire Jewish community, the leadership have been demanding Paul be killed. And they think, well, maybe this guy, or he thinks maybe Agrippa will be able to tell me something worthy of, he must understand what this guy has done worthy of death. And that way he'll have some charges to send with Paul to Caesar.
I'm going to read chapter 26. And if you've been with us the last several weeks, Paul has given his testimony a number of times. He gave it to Felix, he gave it to Festus. Now he's going to give it to King Agrippa, and it's the same. So it's interesting that Luke writes it. Any thought on that before I read it?
Yeah, Mary, it's a good thing to bring out. It's almost word for word. Paul tells about his life before and how zealous he was, how he persecuted Jews. And then he talks about this experience he has, this conversion on the road to Damascus. And it's going to sound pretty word for word, pretty much exactly like what we've heard him say before. And you might think, well, it's redundant. Why does Luke see fit to keep repeating this? Why not just say it looks just like
he said the same thing.
Yeah, he said the same thing he said before. But once again, this is an important story, and Luke goes to the trouble of letting us know that Paul repeats it in its entirety several times. So
Agrippa said to Paul, you have the permission to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today to defend myself against all the accusations of the Jews, especially since you are acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. I beg you, therefore, to listen to me patiently. Surely all the Jews know how I have lived from the earliest days of my youth, among my own people and in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that I lived as a Pharisee, adhering to the strictest sect of our religion. And now I stand on trial because of my hope in the promise that God made to our fathers. The promise our 12 tribes are hoping to realize as they earnestly serve God day and night. Because of this hope, O King, that I'm accused by the Jews, why would any of you consider it incredible that God raised dead? So then I was convinced I ought to do all I could to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is what I did in Jerusalem. With the authority from the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison, and when they were condemned to death, I cast my vote against them. I frequently had them punished in the synagogues, and I tried to make them blaspheme. In my raging fury against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. In this pursuit, I was on my way to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests. About noon, O king, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, it's against the goads. Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus. You're a persecutor, the Lord.
You're welcome. Sorry, I mean, we'll try to get this fixed in a minute.
No, it should be fixed.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can.
It just completely, we lost internet service. That's not something that you plan on. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Where was I?
Well, yeah, that's bad. So let's just paraphrase. Paul tells his same thing. If you look carefully, what he does is, first of all, he says, I used to be one of you. I was just like you, or these Jews. He says, I was, zealous. I was a Pharisee, which is the strictest sect of Judaism. And he says, I go through this experience on the road to Damascus. Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you? He says, I'm Jesus. I'm the one that that you've been persecuting. And he tells Paul, this is one thing that's a little new. He tells him, it's hard for you, Saul, to kick against the goads. And a goad is a little pointed, usually it's a stick, but think of it like spurs. A horse that gets spurs to make him move in a direction, and instead it resists. The horse, pushes again. And what he's telling him, what this message says, you're hurting yourself, Paul, by doing this, by fighting against me. You're harming yourself. This isn't good for you. And so Paul describes the fact that he's still a Jew. The difference is he understands now that Jesus really was this promised Messiah. And he's saying, why should any of you be surprised by this? It's been prophesied since as far back as we go. And here's the prophecy. Why are you guys fighting this so hard? Because this is the fruition, the fulfillment of the prophecy that you've been told about your whole lives. And then if you can see where he talks to Agrippa.
Yeah, and so he says on verse 22, but I have had God's help to this day, and I stand here to testify to small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Christ would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to our people and to the Gentiles. Remember, one of the things these Jewish leaders had most trouble with was that the message was also going to be to the Gentiles. So every time Paul says that, they get angrier, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. He's saying this message is nothing new. This is exactly the prophecy.
This next line is hysterical. Line, verse 24. Just picture this. At this stage of Paul's defense, Festus exclaimed in a loud voice, "You are insane, Paul. Your great learning is driving you to madness." I love that verse.
A lot of speculation on that. But you think, what does Festus care about this? Something about this message that Paul gives seems to reach him, seems to threaten him or touch him. And his reaction is completely, it's out of logic, except that he seems to think that people believe there may be some truth to this, and he's worried about it. So he wants to shut him up. You're nuts. Your great learning has driven you insane. And Paul's response is just very calm.
But Paul answered, "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. I am speaking words of truth and sobriety. For the king knows about these matters, and I can speak freely to him. I am confident that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Then Agrippa said to Paul, can you persuade me in such a short time to become a Christian?
This is kind of a famous passage right here. But what Paul does, the guy says, Festus says, your learning has driven you nuts. He says, I'm not insane.
And remember, Festus is a Roman.
Yeah, Festus, but he turns to Agrippa. And as I told you earlier, Herod Agrippa observes the Jewish feasts. He observes the Sabbaths. And because of that, he's tolerated by the Jewish community that he rules. And so he's made this show of being a Jew. And now Paul turns to him and says, I know that Festus knows about all this stuff. Agrippa knows about all this stuff because he professes it. So I know I can talk to him freely. And he turns to Agrippa and he says, you know this, don't you? Don't you believe in the scriptures, Festus? And Agrippa, I'm sorry, I just can't get off. Agrippa, he says, don't you believe in the scriptures? And Agrippa can't say, no, I don't, because he's made such a show of saying that he's one of them, that he's a Jew. So it puts him on the spot. But Agrippa does know, and actually see in this that Agrippa has heard that Paul is not guilty of anything. But he says, are you going to persuade me, Paul, in such a short time to become a Christian, to become a believer? Do you really think that in this one little speech, I'm just gonna turn to your beliefs, your faith in this Messiah?
And Paul's answer, short time or long, Paul replied, I wish to God that not only you, but all who hear me this day may become what I am, except for these chains. Then the king and the governor rose, along with Bernice and those seated with them. On their way out, they said to one another, this man has done nothing worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar.
And this is just, the story is just so amazing. But he goes through this, and Agrippa, who is the king of the Jews, the guy who should know all of this, listens to Paul's story and says he hadn't done anything wrong. He's not converted. He's not saying, you know what, I accept everything. I accept the faith that you have in this Messiah. But what does happen is, and when he asked him, I love that line, you think you can convert me to Christianity in just this quickly? And Paul says, whether it takes a short time or a long time, I wish that everybody who's listening would be exactly what I am, except for these chains. I wish everyone listening would believe. But Agrippa gets up along with Drusilla and along with Festus, and he's Bernice,
not Drusilla.
Mary's correcting me with the names today. Sorry. It gets, it's also incestuous. But they are sisters, by the way. They're both descendants. But anyway, he gets up and he says, this man hasn't done anything wrong. And he's really he's the king over all of these Jews. And his pronouncement now puts Festus in a bad place, because he says he hadn't done anything worthy of death. He hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, he could have been released. He could have just been let go if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. It's an amazing statement that he's exonerated him. And yet at the same time, because he's demanded to go to Caesar, now Festus has no choice but to send him. And that's where we pick up on this next chapter. That do we have time for it? It's an amazing story.
So, and as we go into chapter 27, the important thing to remember is Paul had heard from God that he was to go to Rome, that he was going to go to Rome. So this whole episode that we just read in 25 and 26 makes perfect sense. He needed to pull the Roman citizenship out to be able to get to Rome, because he really hadn't done anything. And as I said just right here, he would have been let go because he hadn't done anything if he hadn't appealed to Caesar.
And probably that one point, I love it that you mentioned that. It needs to be kept in mind. Paul was innocent of anything, and yet he goes through all of this. He pulls out his Roman citizenship. He's been told he's going to go to Rome. That's what God has in store for him. And see all of these circumstances that just come together to move him, without hesitation. This is moving him towards Rome, where he's supposed to go. And so had he seen Agrippa just maybe weeks earlier, before he said, I want to be taken to Caesar, I want to appeal to Caesar, he wouldn't have been taken to Rome. He would have been let go. Everything comes together. God's plan we see in this unfolding in a way that absolutely makes certain Paul gets to Rome.
Chapter 27, I will admit, I read it and I thought, this is boring, but I am not a fisherman and I don't go out on boats a lot. But I know we have a lot of guys on here that do go out on boats a lot. And now, since studying it this week, this is an amazing chapter. Do you want to give a little before I start it?
Well, no, but I will mention this was when we got the Berean Bibles in. This is what I opened it up to, is the last few lines that we read with Agrippa talking about Paul being released, and this next chapter. And it's just marvelous the way it's phrased. But there have been people who have gone to that part of the world and sailed the exact same route. And after doing that and reading Luke's account, they say, I'm convinced there's no way anybody made this up. This is, and as a guy who spent a lot of time on the water, I can tell you this story is so accurate. It is so perfectly real. Nearly everyone, people who even discount that there was a historical Jesus, read Luke's account in this next chapter, and they say this is a real story of this ocean voyage. So hope that helps.
When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded an Adramyttian ship about to sail for ports along the coast of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. I killed the name again, didn't I?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to talk about this for a second? And do we want to show the map?
Yes, we will. Let me mention first, though, it's time. He's got to send Paul off to Rome. You really don't want to be in the open ocean in the winter. So there's a season where they do all the travel, and there's a season where they don't. And so they have to sort of move. And Paul is assigned a centurion. And a centurion is an important guy. It's someone who's worked his way up through the ranks. And once they reach that point, they're set for life. A lot of the time after they get out, they get a land grant. But a centurion is a very important person. And he assigns a centurion to take Paul back to Rome. And it describes the ship. And what we know about that is it's a ship that is from North Africa.
No, not this one. The first one.
Well, you're just going to correct me all day.
I'm sorry, I am.
That's right. I'm wrong. Yeah.
It's from Adramyttian, which is in my.
And even the one other thing, and then we'll get on with the reading, but to keep in mind is that they don't have passenger ships. So even someone this important has got to find a ship that's going the direction he wants to go. And as soon as one comes available, they hop aboard. It says that Aristarchus is another believer from Asia, comes along with them, and we don't really know why, other than as a companion to Paul.
And this is like the third time we've heard about him. He, remember, was in Ephesus when they had that riot in the theater, and that Paul was asked not to go to by his supporters. So he is part of the early Christian church, and he has been around. Like I said, I think this is the third or fourth mention of him in Acts. The other really important part about this first paragraph, it says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Luke is back. This is the fourth Luke, the we chapters when Luke is part of it is 4 different times in Acts, and this is the 4th time, and Luke will be with Paul from here to the end. And so this chapter with such detail, one of the reasons it could be with such detail is because Luke was a
companion.
and witnessed it himself.
Luke is not charged with anything, but he goes with Paul even to Rome. And because he's there, he's got the ability to write in incredible detail.
So do you want to show the map real quick?
I do.
So, and we will send this map out too, because we're going to go through just some of it today, but, okay. So it doesn't say they started from Caesarea, but they did. And right now we're going to see them going to Sidon and then going over to Myra. We'll see all these cities. And then there's a lot of talk about this island of Crete. And then chapter 27 takes us all the way to Malta. So this is the part that we're going. And that's that Scott says they go up and hug the shoreline as long as they can. They don't want to cross open sea if they don't have to.
Okay. And so, where's the
Stop share right there.
Here it is, stop share. So this is this time of the year when it's beginning to get late in the year for travel, and hugging the coastline. And I see Charles is out there, Charlie. When you're trying to cross the bay and there's a chance of, the north wind, you hug the shoreline, it protects you. And so we see in Luke's description exactly what we know would have happened.
The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration, allowing him to visit his friends and receive their care. After putting out there, we sailed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea, off the coasts of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board.
Okay, so I always don't want to tell you just history. There are reasons for this, but they get up the coast, and this centurion allows Paul to get off the boat and go visit friends. We've told you a lot of times that a Roman soldier who's in charge of guarding a prisoner, if the prisoner escapes, the soldier gets the punishment that the prisoner would have gotten. And so they don't allow these prisoners to just go run off on their own. But this centurion, this very important guy, lets Paul get off the ship, go into town, and visit with friends, visit with these believers. This is a time when it's worth mentioning the believers, this community, what we might call church, they get referred to as the friends. And I love that description. And I think it's such an example for us. It was not called a church. These other believers are just referred to as the friends.
And this is a church that had been started by Paul.
That's right.
And he had visited at least 2 times. So this was the 3rd time he stopped by to see how this church was doing.
Except instead of thinking of it as a church, think of it the way Luke just said. This is a group of believers that Luke refers to as the friends. It's a beautiful thing. And the fact that the centurion shows this trust tells you what he thinks about Paul.
And when it says, this is for the non-boat people. So when they were on the lee of Cyprus on this section, that is on the protected side.
That is right. The lee is the downwind side, so that there's protection for the ship. And it says the winds had turned against us. And that tells you that it's getting up closer. It's the fall, and we're starting to get winds out of the north. And it's a dangerous time to travel in a ship on the open ocean. And so Luke describes hugging the leeward side, the south side of Crete, which is exactly what they would have done.
So they, at this point, they find another ship. They get off the first ship and they find another ship. And this is an Alexandrian ship. And we don't hear all about the ship to the very end, but it's important to know that this ship held 276 passengers. And we don't find that out until verse 37, but I'm going to tell you ahead of time, because I'm always thinking it's like a big boat. And this is a ship. It's 276 passengers. And what's important about the fact that it was an Alexandrian ship, that means it was from Northern Africa, Egypt, or Northern Africa, Egypt. And that's where grain came from. So more than likely, and we hear later on that they did have grain aboard this ship, and the Roman Empire needed grain. And so they would get grain from Egypt.
It's important for people to understand the truth of this story. That's why the details. Luke goes into all of this, but this Alexandrian ship, we learn later, is carrying grain because, as Mary said, the Roman Empire needs grain. And so Caesar has started, you think, why would they travel at a time of the year that's so dangerous? And it's because Caesar has started offering a bonus for people that bring grain during these winter months, fall and winter months. So they get paid extra money. It's hazard pay. And he's also guaranteed any ships that are lost trying to do this, he'll cover the cost of the ship. So it's a way of getting people to travel in these dangerous months. And the fact that it's a grain ship tells us a lot. But I guess the last piece, as Mary mentioned, if you think about this, most people think that Paul was on this boat with a few sailors and a Roman centurion and two other guys. 276 passengers, 276 humans, plus the grain that they're carrying.
And a lot, and they went along this ship. This ship was a grain moving ship. And so the sailors and everything, those were all because of the grain they were moving. And then they said, okay, centurion and your little gang of people that you're moving these prisoners with, you can come aboard too.
Yeah. So okay. They're hugging the leeward shoreline, the protected shoreline, and the wind just keeps turning against them.
After sailing slowly for many days, we arrived at Sindus. When the wind impeded us, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite of Salome. After we had moved along the coast with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage had already become dangerous because it was after the fast. So Paul advised them, "Men, I can see that our voyage will be filled with disaster and great loss, not only to ship and cargo, but to our own lives as well." But contrary to Paul's advice, the centurion was persuaded by the pilot and by the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to sail on. If somehow they could reach Phoenix to winter there, Phoenix was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest.
So bottom line, they get to a place, the north winds are blowing. It's not a good time to travel. They are in a place called Fair Haven, and I don't know why Fair Haven wouldn't have been a good place to spend the winter. I haven't been able to find out, but either it's not as protected as it needs to be. I suspect, though, that the guys who own this ship also want to get the bonus for bringing that grain in during these months. So they probably press harder than they might have, just because if they catch some good weather and they get all the way to Rome, they make a lot of money. But they head off again. They get a little bit of a break in the weather and they head off again, thinking they're going to make this better harbor and spend the winter there.
And we have to stop before the storm at the sea.
a giant storm hits them. It's going to be great. The story is still amazing. But what the last thing we saw here is that Paul tells them this journey is going to be a disaster. It's just, we're going to come to disaster. And even though he tells them that, the pilot of the ship convinces the centurion to press ahead. I think
Because even if the pilot of the ship, even if the ship decided to go on, the centurion could have taken Paul and his people off and waited and got another ship. But the pilot of the ship said, hey, this is, we do this all the time. We can do this.
what we see in this, though, and what you're going to see in the rest of this story is that God reveals things to Paul. Paul acts with such confidence. He tells them things with such confidence and knowledge, and they don't listen to him this time, but it's going to stick with them because they come to understand Paul is not just an ordinary guy. And because of that, it also testifies to Paul's faith in God, to his belief in this Messiah. People see, there's something to this. And so this story serves a number of purposes from that. And we'll see the rest next week.
Mhm.
Sorry about the internet earlier. Thanks for sticking with us. God, you show us that you have a plan over and over again, and we tend to forget it. We tend to look to our own wisdom. We tend to look to our own comfort, and we should know better. We have to learn the same lesson over and over again. And we see this example of Paul, who just believes and surrenders and says, I trust your plan. It's a hard thing for us. That. Our hearts, that we begin to doubt. We begin to lose sight of it. Remind us of your plan this week. And as we go forward, help us to see in these words the fact that you do have a plan. And if we remain faithful, we often see those things unfold in ways that we would never expect. Help us with our faith. Help us with our confidence to move forward when what we'd like to do is just stop and take the safe and easy route. Be with the ones we prayed for, Father. We really ask for your hand and for better outcomes for them. They've all been through so much. And be with us when we have the opportunity to show faith in you and then demonstrate to people around us the reason why we believe and the reason why we know that you're real. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. Can unmute yourself, and thank you, Luis, for hosting in Rockport. You can hit the stop record and then just let the computer stay on, and it'll